Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. The Mississippi Marine Brigade was designed as a rapid amphibious strike force to take out fast moving bands of Confederates operating along the Mississippi River and its tributaries. The brigade had its origins in the U.S. Ram fleet, the brainchild of civil engineer and bridge builder Charles Ellet Jr. He's pictured here. His concept of vessels designed to ram and sink enemy ships dated to ancient times. Ellet's success early in the war ended prematurely with his death from an infected wound he had received in the successful capture of Memphis. That was in 1862. Ellet died in June of that year, and at that point, command passed to his brother, Alfred, he's pictured here, who reorganized the fleet as an amphibious force in late 1862 into 1863. The result of Alfred Ellet's ambitions was a fleet of landing vessels, 7 altogether, and these were uniquely built. They had oak planks outfitted with musket loopholes, iron-plated pilot houses, cranes that lowered a generous gangplank to deploy men, horses, and equipment, plus hoses capable of spraying jets of scalding hot boiler water onto enemies that attempted to board the vessel. Sound familiar? Definitely reminiscent of amphibious crafts deployed during the world wars in the 20th century. So an idea way ahead of its time. The fleet, of course, was named the Mississippi Marine Brigade, and by all accounts, they were a fairly rowdy bunch. Their various special missions to take out marauding bands of rebels sometimes turned ugly and skirted the 19th century rules of engagement. One of the brigade's most unusual missions was described after the war thanks to Delia T. Davis. She was a journalist who is quoted, among other places, in Ulysses S. Grant's Memoirs. Davis was quite the prolific writer, and she interviewed a bunch of folks to talk about the war years and Grant. And in this particular interview with an officer identified only as General B, General B recounted a special mission to Port Gibson ordered supposedly by Major General Grant about August of 1863. This, of course, would be after Gettysburg and after the surrender of Vicksburg. Now, Davis's interview was published in several newspapers in 1899. The version I want to share with you comes from the June 1st edition of the Butte Miner from Butte, Montana. So the story has a sensational headline: 50 girl captives, an incident of the war between the states, young ladies held as hostages. The rebels had captured some northern school marms, and the Union boys made reprisals. In several instances, the result was a wedding of blue and gray. So here's Delia Davis's narrative, this interview that she had with General B. It says, quote, "I was mixed up in one little unrecorded event of the Civil War," said General B, "that was interesting from its very unusualness and which, as I look back upon it, seems strangely picturesque. We were attached to what was known as the Marine Brigade, a little fleet of tin-clad river steamboats that plied up and down the Mississippi after the surrender of Vicksburg. The term tin-clad, by the way, is somewhat misleading, as it is not remotely connected with the white metal, but signifies rather boats heavily planked with oak for the purpose of protecting them somewhat from the ravages of bullets. One day, our little battalion of 4 companies was ordered to steam down the river, disembark at Rodney, march to Port Gibson, and there consult sealed orders in regard to further proceedings. Imagine our surprise upon reading the instructions to find that we were expected to capture and carry back to Vicksburg as prisoners 50 of the most aristocratic Confederate young women in the city. However, we had served long enough to obey orders without question, and provided with guides familiar with the town, we set about our bizarre and not too agreeable task. We first established headquarters at the residence of a prominent Confederate judge. Then, different squads were sent out to call at the homes of the young women and escort them to the place of rendezvous. The instructions were that they must report at headquarters within 2 hours on penalty of their family residence being burned to the ground. The only information we could give them, the whole transaction was as much a mystery to us as to them, was that they were to be taken to Vicksburg as prisoners of war, but were on no account to suffer any discomfort or indignity. Of course, there was great weeping, wailing, and gnashing of teeth from tender mothers, loving sisters, and irate fathers and brothers. But the incident had to be accepted as belonging to the fortunes of war, and at the end of 2 hours, 49 of the 50, attended by anxious friends and relatives, were at the rendezvous. Mercy was implored for the one delinquent, an additional hour was granted, and at their own suggestion, several of the young ladies were dispatched to her home to persuade her to follow their example, to gracefully submitting to the inevitable. The result was that before the hour was up, the last fair prisoner put in an appearance, though in a very defiant mood. Our troubles, however, by no means ended here. Indeed, they were hardly fairly begun. The next question was how to transport our beautiful captives to Rodney, a distance of some 20 miles, over roads that were frightfully in condition from the devastations of war and consequent neglect. All the good horses, too, like all the good men, were off to the war, and as for the carriages, they had most decidedly fallen into a state of innocuous disquietude. There were obviously nothing for us to do, therefore, but to gather all the broken down old horses and dilapidated vehicles in the vicinity, which we somehow managed to hitch together with plow harnesses, bits of rope, straps, and etc. With these improvised coaches drawn up into line, began the process of loading on our victims, and when they were all stowed away, it was a motley looking procession, I can assure you. Even the sound of farewells and the sight of weeping eyes could not blind us to the humorous aspect of the scene. You must remember that we were all pretty young fellows in '63. The Civil War was fought by men whose average age was only 23. Well, we made our way slowly amidst tears and laughter to Rodney, where we embarked for Vicksburg. Upon arriving here, the young women were taken before the provost marshal, who put them on parole, confining them to the limits of the city. Most of them had friends in town with whom they chose to remain, and suitable quarters were found for the rest. The reason for the whole transaction then transpired. It seemed that some northern young women, school teachers, had been taken prisoners by the Confederates and were, at that moment, in their camps, where they were forced to wash and mend for the soldiers and perform other menial services. These Confederate young women were, therefore, to be held as hostages until the northern women were released. There was little delay in the exchange, and we had our fair visitors in Vicksburg only 30 days. They were, however, very gay, delightful days. Yankee officers and Confederate maidens intermingled socially, and the acquaintance so rudely forced upon the beautiful Southerners proved, in some instances, a mutual pleasure. I could indeed point to more than one romantic marriage that was the direct outcome of our raid upon Port Gibson. This is signed Delia T. Davis. So there you have the story of the Confederate prisoners of war, women taken from aristocratic families, and eventually exchanged for Northern school teachers who were being held against their will in Confederate camps as prisoners. So thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.